Even in the so-called Dark Ages and continuing into the medieval period, science and Christianity have traditionally complemented each other and in fact have been intimately connected throughout history. In my previous two videos, I briefly showed with several examples how prominent Christian thinkers from the 1st through the 8th century had no trouble melding the science of the day with their Christian faith. In this video, I will continue to look at how the Christian view of God as a lawgiver, a rational mind, and as the creator gave rise to modern science through the Christian idea of university in the medieval period. The university was a Christian idea, beginning with the University of Bologna in 1088 and followed by Paris and Oxford before 1200, and then many others following Paris. The invention of the church-supported university was the impetus for the scientific revolution of the 16th century. These universities were supported by Christians and run by Christians. Roman colonizers of Greece and Arabic societies left their works largely untranslated. It was the Christian universities that provided the stimulus to translate the ancient Greek and Arabic texts that added a tremendous amount of knowledge to us about nature. Christians were the ones who provided the impetus to translate these works into Latin so they would be available to the general public. European Christians were very open to the earlier work of the Greek and Arab pagans, as this ferocious appetite for translations demonstrates. Roger Bacon's work from the 13th century, Opus Majus, is evidence that the medieval Christians did much to advance science. Bacon, who was a Christian and in fact a Franciscan cleric, read much of the newly translated material and then used it to write his opus on the science of light and optics, as well as model the beginnings of modern experimental science. If you need more evidence that Christianity, in fact, advanced science through the Middle Ages, consider that 30% of the medieval university liberal arts curriculum addressed what we now would call science. As undergraduates, students were also required to argue for and against the scientific ideas of the day. For example, they had to give pro and con arguments about Aristotelian science. The organizational model for knowledge at these medieval universities had theology at its center. Theology was positioned as the beginning of all knowledge, with then philosophy connecting theology to all the other scientific disciplines. This is still really in effect today. If you think about when there's an expert in a certain area and they're given a degree as an expert in a certain area, it's called a doctorate of philosophy. The P in PhD stands for philosophy. So this model with theology at the center of all branches of knowledge set the stage for modern science. Most histories about the rise of science begin with Copernicus in the 15th century and how his work brought about a drastic change in how people thought about the universe. This is absolute fiction because it completely ignores the fact that Copernicus received an excellent education at some of the best Christian universities of the time, University of Krakow, of Bologna, and of Padua. It also assumes that the idea of the Earth orbiting the Sun came to him just out of the blue, instead of simply being the next implicit step to what the Christian scientists had formulated and to what the Christian universities had taught for the past 2 centuries. To the Greeks, continuous motion required continuous force. This thought about the heavenly bodies continued through Aquinas in the 13th century. William of Ockham, however, broke from this Greek tradition in the 14th century, and because of his belief that space was actually a vacuum, could argue that a body in motion may not require continuous pushing, as the Greeks thought, and once a body had been set in motion by God, it would just remain in motion. This is an extension of the idea of Saint Basil of Caesarea from the 4th century. Jean Buridan, rector at the University of Paris in the 14th century, extended on this idea, and actually his writings anticipated Newton's first law of motion. Buridan also proposed that the Earth turned on its axis. So objections to the Earth moving, such as why there is not a constant wind and why arrows do not land far away from where they are shot, these were also addressed in the 4th century by both Nicole d'Orenzme and Albert of Saxony, with explanations that sound a lot like Newton's inertia. In the 14th century, Christian university professors began to teach that sunrise and sunset could be caused by the rotation of the Earth. So in the 1300s, it was no longer necessary to assume that the sun circled the Earth. Nicholas of Keas took the next step in the 15th century by proposing that motion is relative, and that no matter what heavenly body a person is on, it will always look to them that they are motionless and every other body is moving. By the 1400s, humans did not need to trust their perception that the Earth was stationary. Nicholas also used evidence from eclipses to argue that the Earth is smaller than the Sun, but the Earth is larger than the Moon and Mercury. All of this theorizing from Occam, Buridan, D'Orensme, Albert, and Nicholas was known prior to Copernicus and taught at the Christian-centered universities. The scientific revolution did not begin with Copernicus. He simply took the next logical step from what was already being taught in the Christian-run and Christian-centered medieval universities. Science and Christianity have traditionally complemented each other and have been intimately connected throughout history. Science was not held back during the so-called Dark Ages and during medieval times. In fact, scientific thought continued to move forward, even foreshadowing Newton's laws and providing the scaffolding needed for Copernicus. The medieval church supported and encouraged science by beginning and funding the university. This new institution funded translation of Greek and Arabic science texts. The study of science and medicine for the first time found a permanent home in these Christian-run and Christian-funded schools. Dozens of universities introduced large numbers of students to Euclidean geometry, to optics, to medicine, to astronomy, to arguments for the sphericity of the Earth and arguments for a moving Earth. Also provided them with a way to argue against Aristotle. This, in turn, gave rise to the beginnings of modern science. Nature and Scripture have complemented each other. Nature, or science, and Christianity have had a synergistic relationship throughout history. If you want to learn more about this connection, here are some places you can visit.